Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming for day 2 of the seminar. We're less people than yesterday, but I'm glad that everybody is here. I think people are still streaming in. And so just a recap of yesterday. Yesterday we learned about the history of cannabis. We learned about Linnaeus and O'Shaughnessy. Quiz question. What year was THC isolated? What year? Right over there. Yeah, that's right. Was that a good year? 1964? In Israel it was, right. Raphael Mechoulam, 1964, April 20th. That's where people, the there is a kind of a aura that's where 420 came from, but that's probably not accurate. It's just a coincidence. So April 20th, 1964. So we talked about the history of cannabis. We talked about reefer madness. We talked about cannabis being how many? Tell me how old cannabis is. When were the earliest? If you had to, is it hundreds, decades, thousands? And where was it first seen or used by humans? China? Yeah. So basically it moved from the east to the west, from China, from India, from Afghanistan, etc., that region to the Middle East, over to Europe and onwards into the west. So we talked about the history of cannabis, and Ira gave us a great overview of that, and the entry of cannabis into the modern world, the early days when hemp was used for ropes, etc., and fiber. We talked about, then we moved into the science of cannabis, where we discussed CB1 receptors. Where are CB1 receptors largely located? I like it over there. He's going like this. So in the central nervous system, largely, but you do find them in other areas of the body. And CB2 receptors, where are they? Where are they found? Throughout the rest of the body. So everywhere else. The peripheral, the immune system, lung, liver, kidneys, etc. So, but you do find a mixture of CB1 receptors there too. So we learned about all that, and we learned about, tell me the two compounds or molecules that are considered endogenous cannabinoids. Remember that talk by Ira? Give me one. That table over there, Evan's table. Very good. I said one, but you gave me two, but I'll take it. So 2-AG, they're that good. 2-AG and anandamide, very good. And we talked about exogenous phytocannabinoids, and the two main ones, THC and CBD. And if you recall, CBD is the non-intoxicating cannabinoid, whereas THC can cause the euphoria and intoxication, both of them being used for medicinal purposes. So we went through that and more yesterday. We also talked about the pharmacology of cannabis. We talked about the quick onset within minutes of inhaled cannabis. We talked about the delayed onset of oil-based products, often hours. We discussed also the metabolites, the active metabolite of THC, and the inactive metabolite, which is found in urine tests. We talked more about the pharmacokinetics, and we also talked about drug interactions. And can you tell me, for THC, for the pharmacist in the room in particular, can you tell me the two main enzymes that THC, the cytochrome enzymes that THC funnels through? Pharmacists, and I see pharmacists over there. Very good. Wealth Pharmacy, should we give them a round of applause? Yeah, okay, good. Excellent. So, and then we have CBD, which is, any takers on CBD and its metabolism? No? Okay, so we know that two of the enzymes are the same, 3A4 and 2C. What's the unique one? 2C19 is the extra one that funnels through the metabolism of CBD. So we learned about a lot of those things yesterday. You also had a vaporizer demonstration, and for those of you that were with us on the tour, we got to see some fish and how fish excrement and nitrates help plants grow, which was rather amazing. And then if anyone likes tilapia, go over to Green Relief, and they might be able to donate a fish or two to you. Now, today, we are going to be talking about the principles of cannabis dosing. So Dr. Ira Price will be leading that lecture. We're going to skip the morning coffee break because we had a late start. We were kind of waiting for people to kind of come in. And then we have Dr. Tyler Wish, who is going to talk about precision cannabis, data-driven insights to help individualize cannabinoid therapy. And he's going to review that. That is a division of NAC, and we're hoping to do research in the future, perhaps sometime next year, that will, for the partners that work with us, we'll be able to gain insights to the most effective chemotype of cannabis that will possibly allow us to give a specific outcome. So when we're looking for a certain outcome, what does somebody's DNA say about what their enzymes encode for? Can we somehow match that to a specific cannabis chemotype, which will produce a specific outcome? But Tyler is going to talk more about that. We'll have Dr. Paul Danick from Winnipeg. He'll be joining us and talking about medicinal cannabis in oncology. That's going to be a good talk if you've ever heard him speak at CCIC. He's a very knowledgeable speaker in this area. Later in the afternoon, we're going to talk about the patient referral process, consultation, and education process. We're also going to talk about the role of community pharmacists in medicinal cannabis, and we're going to do a little website unveil, and we're also going to explain a little bit further about the process of how NACM can work with healthcare providers to allow patients responsible access to medicinal cannabis, and also the education of those patients and making sure that there are positive outcomes. So without further ado, we have Ira Price. Principles of Cannabis Dosing is the first lecture, and then after that it will be Dr. Tyler Wish. So Ira, welcome to the stage.
Good morning again, everyone. I'm going to use the this portable mic thing because I move around a lot. There are still, y'all remember me. I don't have to introduce myself again. That loud, obnoxious guy that tends to get up here and talk a lot. That's me. Okay. Who likes driving in Toronto? Nobody. Who lives here? Honestly, this town drives me nuts, so I'm wearing my Hamilton is home, because every road here is closed and I cannot stand the traffic. Like it's just a mess. This should go pretty quickly because you're pharmacists and you'll hopefully understand a lot of the stuff I'm talking about. So when I say bioavailability, I don't have to, probably won't spend 20 minutes explaining what bioavailability means. We're talking about dosing and principles of dosing. Right, don't press the X button because that'll turn things off. We're not working. Oh, now we're working. We're not working. Wow. Nope. Is it working? There we go. Now we're on. Thank you. Round of hand. That's for tech. Good job, buddy. You're awesome. Okay, y'all know me. Objectives. So we're going to talk about. We're talking about the Price protocol for dosing cannabis. It was named after me, but not named by me. It was named by another physician. Okay, and because I wouldn't have named it after myself. But it was developed, it's based on empirical evidence over about a decade of prescribing cannabis. At the time, actually, it probably wasn't even a decade. It was about it's been around for about 3 or 4 years now. So it's probably about 5 years that it was in development based on the treatment of, a couple thousands of patients. So maybe 3,000 to 5,000 patients at the time. And it was developed over a period of time, and it became a price protocol. I was actually named by Daniel Schachter one day. We were sitting having, drinking coffee. He said, "Why don't you just name it X?" I'm like, there you go, you can name it. So we're going to talk about drug math and bioavailability. When I talk about, we don't always love math. You guys love math, but when you talk about drug math, everybody can do drug math. So it makes it pretty easy for people. And then we'll talk about the equations that I've created or that exist and that I've sort of put together in order to form the basis of all the dosing that we do when we talk about cannabis. Talk about the required dosing for different cannabinoids because there are differences between dosing THC and CBD. Of course, this is all empirical evidence. There isn't very much out there in terms of RCTs or high-grade evidence for dosing. Eventually, it'll be put to the test, but it's been doing pretty well over the last little bit, and it provides you a basis for where to start your patients. And we'll talk about how to initiate the protocol. So, first thing is we should all know that there's no internationally held standard for guidelines for dosing cannabis. They just don't exist. We've had guys that came out there like Grant and Ware and Lynch and Campbell, another guy, Clark, the guys that sort of the 4 or 5 that in the research world that came before me came out with some basic principles that are like start low, go slow, but what does that actually mean to us? Here's your drug, go start low, go slow. I'm like, what's low mean? So we had to come up with some sort of way to identify that or quantify that, and that's kind of what I've done. Variables, of course, there are multiple variables when it comes to dosing cannabis. So you got to think about what is the strain, what is the percent cannabinoid. The question, who doses in percentages? Unless it's like some sort of cream here, 2%, whatever, cortisone cream. But if you're giving somebody a pill, here, go take 2%. Like, what does that actually mean? So how do you convert a percentage to a milligram when we're talking about cannabis? What's 15% THC? Here's your 15% strain, or your 20% strain, or your 5% strain. How do you translate that into a milligram? How do you tell somebody if we're trying to be scientific about it? We dose in milligrams, or grams. We don't dose in percentages. So we had to come up with ways to do that. When I first started, here we go. I'll try to make this one quick. When I first started, the U.S., even though it was very quite community-based, they were always dosing in milligrams, even on their edibles at the time. Even if they were in dispensaries, they'd have. It would say this had like 10 or 15 milligrams of THC in their whatever brownie. But here in Canada at the time, if you had made your own brownie, it would be like, oh, that was made with 15% THC. Okay, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. So I couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap, and I kept going back and forth. And the only way to really do it is with proper testing and analysis of THC. But we didn't have proper testing facilities then. So we were sort of guessing. Whenever you have a strain, and if you look at Health Canada's initial guideline that came out back in, 2013, 2014, Guide for Healthcare Practitioners. Has anybody seen it? It's like a 300-page e-document, right? We've all read that. What are the risks, benefits? When it talks about percentages to milligram, if it says 1%, that's like 7 milligrams or something. That's all sort of guessy work because we didn't have proper testing facilities to do that. Now that we do, when we test cannabis, and I'll tell you what that actually means, when you say what percentage, if it's like a 10% strain, it basically just means if they took 100 grams of cannabis and they tested it, 10% of that 100 grams was THC. That's basically all it means. That's all it means when you say percentage, right? So the question is, how do we convert all that stuff? It now becomes a lot more simple that we test our cannabis, which is why it's so important to actually test the cannabis. Where if you go to the street and you get cannabis, you have no idea because it's not quality assured. That's what we talk about when we talk about testing cannabis. So variables, the percent of the cannabinoid that's in it, cannabinoid itself, the method of use, because the bioavailability changes. Whether you're ingesting it, vaporizing it, smoking it, transdermal patching it, using it as a suppository, all those types of things change the bioavailability. And then, of course, I think the most important process, the most important thing to take in mind and take into consideration when prescribing or when educating patients on the use of cannabis is that this is a collaborative process. We're losing that, archaic patriarchy of medicine, of take your medicine, go home, leave me alone, to call me in 2 months. It doesn't work like that with cannabis. It does take a little bit more time. And this is one of the reasons why there's fear around physicians prescribing it, because it does take a little extra time. You can't, and we don't have time with all the budget cuts and everything going down. Nobody has time. The physicians aren't here today. The family docs took off. We don't have, what's that? Yeah, one, yeah, but there's 2 other ones. I didn't know. I only knew 2 of them here. Sorry, apologize. So a couple of them are here, but with all the budgetary cuts, we don't even have, unless you're working in a FIG or a FO, you don't really have the time to spend with the patient to explain to them how to use their cannabis. But that's where you guys come in, and that's why it's so important to put that pharmacist back in the middle, because you can take 5 minutes, won't even take, maybe 3 minutes just to explain to them how to use it. And that's where it becomes so important to work in this collaborative process and provide them the education that they need. So what do we do? What do we know? We know that the PK and PD, we know the pharmacodynamics and kinetics of inhaled cannabis are well established, especially when it comes to inhalational cannabis. This is the study that you want to look at. If you want to look at PK, like proper PK PD stuff when it comes to cannabinoids, that's where you want to start with anyways. Very good place to start. And then we know with proper testing and proper assurance, and by the way, these are all the assumptions that went into creating the protocol. With proper testing and quality assurance, we can be accurate to the actual quantities of the different cannabinoids that are inside the THC, or that are inside the strains or chemotypes, chemobars, whatever you want to call them. I call them strains, it's just easier for myself. So within each strain, we know that we now know with proper quality assurance and testing how much THC and how much CBD are in each one. We know that inhalational cannabis is easily self-titratable and has linear onset and linear offset. So we know that you've got 3 to 5 minutes onset and a first half-life of 45 to 2 hours. Usually within 45 minutes gone. It's very linear with inhalational cannabinoids, and it doesn't matter. Metabolism doesn't really matter. Body habitus doesn't really matter. Maybe lung function matters a little bit, but that's about it. But with oral cannabis, or orally ingested cannabis, we know there's a lot of variability. If you look at time to onset and offset, and you look at absorption rates, it's like this model that goes like a nice roller coaster. Reminds me of another story. I told a resident once. This is a funny story. We have residents in medicine. I think he was a clerk. He was a clerk actually, and we were looking at an X-ray of an abdomen, and we were looking at a gut, and there was like this really sharp turn of I think it was inferior, I can't remember, it may have been terminal ileum you can see, and it was this really sharp turn. I told him it was called the behemoth sign because of the roller coaster at Canada's Wonderland. So the guy's walking around the rest of the day, and the emerge is like, I just saw the behemoth sign. Anyway, I thought it was really funny. It was totally not true, but I mean, I told him eventually, but it was, anyway, forget it. You guys are still just as tough as you were yesterday. Okay, so, all right, so inhalational cannabis, so oral cannabis, lots of variability, okay, goes up and down. So, and it also goes through first pass metabolism, which is why we sort of, with inhalational cannabis, we get to skip all that stuff and we get a good effect. I'll tell you, when I use inhalational cannabis, the way I take people off of narcotics, especially when they're on long-acting and short-acting, I use inhalational cannabis through vaporizing. I use that as short-acting, instead of a short-acting opioid, right? Instead of your Percocet, you're going to start vaporizing because it gets rid of that. Now, for long-acting, because it's usually about 30 to 60 minutes onset and lasts 4 to 5 hours, when you ingest cannabis, that's what I use for their sustained release, right? So if they're on hydromorph contin or something, that's how I start getting them off of that, using ingesting cannabis. So now I use inhalational cannabis and oral cannabis. That's how we bring it together, and I help people. That's how we get people off of opioid therapy. And then, of course, we have the start low, go slow. That was coined by Ware and Lynch back in 2009. And also, I also have this concept that, this is my concept, is change the dose before you change the strain. Make sure you're at the right location before you're at the right level before you start changing your strains. The good news about cannabis is, unlike some other medications where we just have one of them, we have hundreds of different strains, right? So we can always switch it up. But let's make sure we're at the right place before we start switching their strain. So how to convert a percentage into a milligram? I think you guys probably know this already. 10% basically, like I just mentioned earlier on, if you know that if you have a strain that says 10% THC, whenever you hear somebody say a percentage, they're usually telling you the percentage of THC. I'll tell you, most of my dosing is based on dosing THC because that's the one that people feel euphoric with, and that's the one thing that most people are trying to avoid. I will talk about how to dose CBD as well. It's a little more, it's easier to dose, but difficult to get to levels that have been found to be beneficial. So, but when we talk about a strain that's 10%, even though on the bottle we say it's got, we're now talking about, if it's an oral thing, we're talking in milligrams. But when we have a strain, we usually, in Canada, we talk about the THC first, then the CBD. I'm going to say we're talking about THC for this given example. So let's say it says 10% on your flower. What does 10% mean? That means if they test 100 grams, that's what an LP does, 10% of that 100 grams is pure THC, right? So you have 100 milligrams per gram, basically is how it converts down. So if I have 1 gram, I have 100 milligrams per gram. Make sense? That's just breaking it down. So that's pretty easy. Now, if you have 20% THC, break it down easier. What would that be? 200 milligrams per gram. That's the simplest way to break it down, and it's fairly accurate. It's very accurate. So we have to then understand. So now we understand how to convert a percentage into a milligram, because when we dose, we should be dosing based on milligrams. We shouldn't be dosing based on percentages. But that doesn't mean they're going to get everything that's in that plant. If we have a strain that has 10% or 100 milligrams per that 1 gram, how much of it are they actually going to get? You're not going to get that whole 100 milligrams. Then we have to understand what bioavailability is. So, for example, if you're using combustion, you're actually only going to end up getting 10% of that 100 milligrams because the bioavailability of, or how much you can actually functionally use when talking about combustion, is only 10 to 15%. Seems like a big waste of money. That's also how I convince people to start vaping. So here's the equation, the proposed equation that I've been using for a long time. The available cannabinoid, THC, CBD, any cannabinoid that has a percentage on it that's been tested for, per gram of cannabis is equivalent to the percent concentration of that cannabinoid per gram multiplied by the bioavailability of the selected mode of administration. Make sense? Questions on that? No, pretty sure. Yes, we're getting there. There'll be lots of examples, but thanks for asking. It's exactly where we're going. Okay, so vaporization, for example, has 50% bioavailability. So let's say now I have to use simple numbers like 10 and 20% because we can always break those down really simple. So let's say now we have 100 milligrams of or a 10% strain. This has 10% THC, right? And this is also, by the way, when we talk about, when the guideline came out by the College of Family Physicians that says you shouldn't dose anybody greater than 9% THC, they had no idea what they were talking about. And I'm okay saying that, and they're welcome to come talk to me. I've tried multiple times. That means 90 milligrams, right? That's, if they're correct in one way. If a person was getting 90 milligrams, yeah, sure, that's really high. We could probably stop there. But let's say they're using a vaporizer, right? Even I'm not going to use 90 because that's still too complicated for me. I'm going to 10. So 100. So if you're using a vaporizer, and we look at this and we say your bioavailability, the functional amount of cannabis you can actually get into your body that will take effect is 50%. So when we first started, and we were using a 10% strain, which is equivalent to how many milligrams? 100, right? 10%, multiply it, right? Multiply it out. So you have 100 milligrams. Right away, before you even start using it, what's the functional amount they can get from that whole gram? 50 milligrams, right? I haven't told you what the average use is for one therapeutic dose yet, but just imagine you're already down to 50 milligrams from that 1 gram. It's going to cost somebody a lot of money if I was to tell you that the average inhalational dose for one therapeutic use, even according to Health Canada, which could vary between 7 and 250 milligrams, as we sort of looked at, is around 20 milligrams of THC. So if you don't want a person having to buy 5 grams a day and waste a lot of money, using 9% THC doesn't really work out all that well. Because I can tell you, if you stuff it into a vaporizer, you could put in about 1/4 gram. And if you're looking at 50 milligrams and you need 20 milligrams for one therapeutic dose, you're going to have to use a lot of it, right? Versus having something, let's say, that has 20% THC. You break it down, you have 100 milligrams, you now have 4 good doses per day from that 1 gram, right? Or 5, depending on if you're using 0.25 or 0.2. Right? Does that sort of make sense? I'll go back and explain it to you. We'll go through that. I'm bringing the concept up early so we can think about it as we go. So, vaporization, 50% bioavailability. It avoids first-pass metabolism. We're doing well. Oral ingestion, approximately 20 to 30% bioavailable if first-pass metabolism is included. You cleave a whole bunch of it off as it goes through first-pass metabolism. But that doesn't mean when you ingest cannabis, it always does that. You have mucosal uptake. For example, if we were able to, which we have now, as we mentioned earlier on, cannabis is hydrophobic, right? It's lipophilic. It likes fat, doesn't like water, doesn't pass basement membrane very well. But if you make it water soluble, for example, with an emulsification, right, and a solvent, and you put it into an oral dose and you swish it around in your mouth, and there's guys out there now that have sports drinks and all this other stuff, and it can get absorbed orally through the oral mucosa, then you're doing really well. 1, it's quicker to onset. 2, you can avoid most of first-pass metabolism. And 3, you can get almost up to 80%, 60 to 80% bioavailability from that method of use. Ingestion is variable, as I mentioned. If you're orally ingesting flower, and it's going through first-pass metabolism. I'll tell you, most of the oils, like all of the oils, from licensed producers currently, that's how it works. You ingest it. You know, people say put on your tongue. It's not going to make a difference. You're still going to swallow it. It's not getting absorbed. It's in an oil. You ever try to swish oil around in your mouth? It's going nowhere. So you're best off just swallowing the stuff, putting it in your food, and let it do its thing through your gut and through first-pass metabolism. So when you go to an LP, which we will be doing, a licensed producer, and we get our cannabis in the oil droppers, you can just tell them put it on their food. You can swallow it, do whatever you want. Sticking it in your mouth and swishing it, it's just going to taste bad. But you're going to get 20 to 30% bioavailability. Then combustion, which is people's number one way. You know, we spoke about it yesterday, because the number one reason why people like to combust, 1, it's easy. They think they're going to save a lot of money this way. So as soon as you tell them you're only getting 10 to 20%, or even 10 to 15% of the actual stuff you're using, just buy a vaporizer, you save your money within a month. It's a pretty easy sell at that point in time. But also combustion, I mean, combustion's just bad, right? We spoke about do you tell your people to freebase their Percocet? No. So don't tell them to combust. It's kind of like the same idea. You know, the argument you're going to get back is, you know, Tashkin back in I spoke about him a little bit yesterday. Tashkin in 1997, he's from UCLA, or USC, or UCLA. Does somebody know? I can't remember. Tashkin, I'm going to guess. This is just off. I got a 50-50 chance, so I'm going to say UCLA. And I sat on a panel with him last year, and I can't remember. Anyway, So he's like he's probably the world's largest researcher and has the largest, conglomeration or collaboration of researchers when it comes to respirology and cannabinoids. So his argument, he was actually the government of the United States back in 97, early 90s, late 90s, were trying to prove how bad cannabis was for your health and for your lungs and all this stuff. So he had people smoke a lot of cannabis and see what it did for them. In the meantime, he is now one of the largest proponents for the use of cannabis because he found that it was a bronchodilator, your FEV1 improved, but combustion wasn't good. Combustion, when taken out on its own, taken away from the plant, and you take away things like smoking cigarettes and alcohol, it still has a risk of cancer, about 2.2 times the increased risk of lung cancer from smoking cannabis, removing things like alcohol and tobacco. So you have to account for those things first. But people's argument is, what he also showed is that cannabis was an antioxidant, and the antioxidant of the plant can offset the effect of cancer. Yeah, well, sure it can. That makes sense, but you're never going to get enough antioxidant into you to offset the effects of all the crap that you're going to get from smoking and combustion. It's incomplete combustion, from incomplete combustion. Complete combustion is not a bad thing, I guess, but from incomplete combustion, which is using a lighter and all the other stuff. So combustion is just bad. There, I hope I've convinced you all to tell people not to smoke. I sort of feel like it's one of those do as I say, not as I do things. But no, I mean, overall, smoking's not good. Unless, there's no unless in that. Okay, I'll leave that out. Who went out last night? Just pointing that out. Okay, so then you have mucosal, and we just spoke about it. I'm going to get off this slide. It's been around a long time. Okay, so let's continue. Vaporization. We're going to say 20%, because I use the 10 and 20s. So now let's say we have 20%, because 10% we sort of know. We break it down. You end up with 50 milligrams. And if the average person, as you're going to soon find out, needs about 20 to 25 milligrams, eventually takes time to get to that therapeutic dose. But that's Health Canada lists that. Like these are standards. We don't have them. They were used in the randomized control trials that were done for specific diseases. For example, within the MS studies, they usually had them use 20 milligrams. That's usually what they got them up to. Problem was when they said we had these side effects, including dizziness and heart tachycardia and paranoia, they never used a progression up to them. If you look at the methodology, they sort of just went, here's 20 milligrams, let's use it. So there is a progression, and that's what eventually all of this is going to lead us to, how to actually dose somebody, and there will be a progression. But let's say for now we have 20 milligrams of THC, which is equivalent to 200 milligrams per gram, before accounting for bioavailability. If we're talking about vaporization, we're talking about around 50% bioavailability. So before you even start using the strain, you have 100 milligrams of THC that can actively reach circulation or effectively be used. Okay? Now, if we have that on the bottle, if we're using combustion, 200 milligrams per gram, after accounting for bioavailability, which would be around, now you're down to about 20 milligrams per gram. So you see the difference? Like you see the functional amount? This is a great method, great tool to use when talking to patients and talking even to the general public when educating them on what the difference is between vaporization and combustion. These are the things that I accounted for when going into the protocol. So how much does somebody actually need? So as per Health Canada, as per Health Canada, somewhere between 7 and 250 milligrams per day. So they're super helpful when it came to this. What I can tell you, the typical dose ranges between 5 milligrams and 40 milligrams for therapeutic dose. The way that I use it at the end of the day, what I find is 20 milligrams, somebody between 20, and this is inhalational. This isn't oral. Oral can be far lower, right? And that's all based on habitus and comorbidities and metabolism, all that stuff, which is why it's so important to start low and go slow. Some people do fine with just 1 milligram, where some people need 40 milligrams, right? And that's all based on metabolism. Somewhere around 20 milligrams. For CBD, and this is per day, not in a milligram per kilogram per day. This is a per day. You could divide that into different doses. Usually what I find is that 20 to 25 milligrams per therapeutic use is most appropriate for people. That's usually where they'll find them. And I'll tell you how many inhalations that is off of a vaporizer and things like that when we get to the actual protocol. But then CBD. So the studies that are done on CBD, for example, in the seizure world, they use 3 milligrams per kilogram per day, divided doses. You can divide it however you want. 3 milligrams per kilogram per day. That is a lot. How many people actually think it's easy to get that kind of CBD? It's next to impossible. Most of the strains that we have on the market are the highest you have. You have a couple LPs, licensed producers, for example, that have, there's one that has a really high CBD content per milliliter. When we talk about orally ingested cannabis, we're talking about the oils from an LP. They all come in 1 milliliter. It comes in like a 40 to 60 milliliter bottle, but the dropper looks like the Tempera dropper. It kind of 1 milliliter bottle. And Health Canada has the regulations that you can't exceed more than 30 milligrams of THC per milliliter, and they all come in 1 milliliter. You have this 1 milliliter dropper. The most CBD I've seen on the market is 100 milligrams of CBD per 1 milliliter. That's awesome. That's great. The problem is the only way you can get that is on a very, very special needs basis, and it's only produced by one LP, and it's used for a study at sick kids currently. So that's the only place they actually will give it out to you. Now you can go through back channel and get it, but who wants to do that for medicine? Doesn't make any sense. So the average you can get on a regular basis, you could get upwards of 25 milligrams of CBD per 1 milliliter. But if I just said that, for seizures, for example, and Dravet syndrome, or neuroprotective stuff is upwards of 3 milligrams per kilogram per day, and you're looking at the cancer stuff and all the free radical scavenging in the brain, you're upwards of 3 milligrams per kilogram per day, and you're weigh 70 kilo. That's pretty darn tough. That's super difficult to get. So most of us aren't getting the amount of CBD that we need. But that being said, we don't have any large studies currently on does a little bit of it work? I can empirically tell you, and from empirical evidence, it does, but it's also great if you can get them up there. The pediatric population, no problem, I can get them up there because they don't weigh all that much. Now, what's down at the 0.5? That's where you're looking at about the pain stuff. Pain stuff is about 0.5 milligrams per kilogram per day, and you can divide that into daily doses. It doesn't have to be in one dose. A lot of CBD has the potential to produce headaches and hypotension as well. So you can feel a little bit of, with the muscle relaxation and all that stuff, you can sort of feel a little bit dopey. So if you're using high doses. So then you can always divide that into different doses. So at that point, if you're doing, if you're looking at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram per day, you're okay with using 20 milligrams 3 times a day. You're probably in the right spot. Or even 15 milligrams, which is easy to get from an oil. And it's okay to start people with like significantly higher doses than you do with THC, because they're not going to get that psychoactive effect. Does that make sense? We good? And we also spoke about we did this yesterday, so I'm going to skip that. We know that. All right, so combustion. I love to just, I keep pressing the wrong button here. This one. It's the one with the, I don't know what that is. It looks like laser. Frickin' laser beams. No? Remember that? Little Austin Powers? No? Okay. Okay, combustion. So not recommended. We already talked about the inherent danger of combustion, not good. Also because of excessive costs. I like to keep, I'm going to keep on, pounding this home that combustion isn't bad. Is bad, sorry. And that's because most people just want to smoke a joint. They think it's easier if you get pre-rolls and all this other stuff. And in the lifestyle market, that's what most people are still pressing. That's why I go to these events that are the lifestyle and community events, because I go there and say, guys, are we not trying to move towards a promotion of wellness and health, even in the lifestyle market? So why would we still combust? Why don't you just vape? And you get, you can get the aroma you get, the better. If you're a connoisseur of wine and you want to be a connoisseur of cannabis in the lifestyle market, you're better off vaping because you can get all the flavors of the terpenes. You're not just burning them off. You get more of the taste, and you can actually appreciate it more. That's from a lifestyle world, not from a medical world. Medical world, it's still better because it's of all of these other reasons. Now, we talked about cost. Vaporization. We recommend that, of course, because of the safety, bioavailability, and cost effectiveness. Initially, the price, when you have patients that come in or clients and you're like, you guys should buy, you'll have a package here of includes your vaporizer, and they'll be, why do I need this vaporizer? Say, because it's going to save you a lot of money in the long run. Within a month, that's not a long run. That's still within a month period of time. And then we could talk about oral ingestion. Health Canada, and I'm sure you've read these guidelines, say somewhere between, and the reason I put this in here is because if you're literally taking dried flower and just ingesting dried flower and you don't decarboxylate it, or, process of, well, you all know what that is, and you're not decarbing your cannabis, if you literally just ingest it without decarboxylation, it goes through first-pass metabolism and all this stuff, it's pretty much a waste of money. You need somewhere between 2 and 2.2 times the amount that you would use from even a combusted dose. So you need a lot of that extra cannabis. So you're looking at like somewhere around 1 gram to 1.5 grams just for eating cannabis on its own, and it tastes disgusting. So my suggestion is you just skip that altogether and either decarb your cannabis and then put it into something, and in extraction, which we haven't gone through here today, but there may be videos eventually of all this stuff if you want to learn about that or whatnot. And then each patient, of course, responds differently to an oral dose of cannabis. Whoa, that's a green slide. There's no evidence, of course, for specific strains. These are all things, by the way, that go into, we haven't even gotten to the protocol yet. I'm just giving you background so we understand how it is that we're dosing, why I came up with these numbers that we're going to get to. So there's no evidence for the use of a specific strain. There is for specific diseases, but I can't tell you go take your blackberry, mango, haze, kush, whatever, cookies and things and all these other names that we have for strains. I can't tell you take that strain and it's going to be and that's going to be effective for this X disease. We don't have specific strains yet. We're going to get there. That's what we're working on currently. But what we do have is that THC works for X and CBD works for Y. That we do have. So that's how we dose. Now, based on experience as time goes on, what you're going to learn is that we have this concept of the entourage effect, and every strain has a different amount of different terpenes and flavonoids combined with the cannabinoids with the THC and CBD, and they do have different effects. That being said, there are some certain places that I like to start, but when I dose, I don't dose on strain, I dose on THC and CBD. No, so you're thinking of Epidiolex, or you're thinking of Charlotte's Web in the U.S. that they use for seizure disorder. So Charlotte's Web, which actually comes from industrial hemp, is a CBD strain, that pure CBD strain that's been tested or being tested currently for Dravet syndrome. They haven't actually said Charlotte's Web is the strain you have to use. They said high CBD is, which is why we have things like Epidiolex and why other LPs have 100 milligrams of CBD in 1 drop of oil that they're testing currently. So it's not a specific strain, except I do think eventually, Charlotte's Web will be the one used. That's the one Sanjay Gupta talked about on the CNN and all that stuff. And you can import it into Canada for a specific person. Otherwise, you can't take CBD over the border because CBD technically is still illegal. They're changing that October 17th. The Hemp Regulation Act, or in the Cannabis Act, hemp is getting its own sort of new place. But currently, you still can't take them across the border unless you get an exemption specifically for Charlotte's Web you can go through the government to get. So no evidence for specific strains. There is evidence for specific cannabinoids in disease, for example, THC nausea, CBD inflammation. We spoke about all that yesterday. Strain selection is highly individualized. Some people do well with one strain, some do with the other. What you notice is there's some go-tos that are always good to start with, but also how to start them becomes an issue. So try multiple strains, manipulating THC to desired effect. And there's rarely any reason in my mind, which is one of the major basises, I don't know, is that a word? One of the major basises, no, that doesn't sound right. I'm going to skip that word. It's one of the major reasons why the protocol doesn't use a THC greater than 25%. Because there's really rarely in my mind anything that needs more than 250 milligrams per gram of THC for a medical reason. The reason why I like using 25% THC as a strain is because it breaks down very nicely into 4 good doses of 25 milligrams, right? So it breaks down very simply when you're loading a vaporizer. And I'll tell you why. So what's required to initiate the dosing protocol? Well, it depends where you start from. You have the vaporization only, and we're going to take you through the charts. We have the vaporization only method, you have an ingestion only method, and then you have a combination of vaporization plus ingestion. I like to start people with vaporization, move them on to ingestion. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, when you vaporize cannabis, the onset is very fast and the offset is really quick. It's also easily self-titratable. If you started off with 1 inhalation day 1 or day 2 and it didn't work, you can use 2 or 3 the next day or 4 to 5 at that same time or whenever. Whereas once you ingest something, you can't take it back. It's stuck there. It's going to be whatever effect it is. So to get to the desired effect, it's always easiest to start with vaporization. That being said, it's also a little bit more complicated to start somebody with vaporization, because now you got to teach them how to use a vaporizer or use a grinder and all this stuff. The good news is the things that you don't know about, or you may have learned yesterday. Can I get a vaporizer for a quick sec? Ooh, that's bright. What kind of vaporizer is that? That's the battery. No, I don't want to turn it on. I just want to know where the chamber is. Down there? Okay. Yeah, that's good. All right. So the chamber where you put your cannabis, for the most part, fits only between 0.25 and 0.33 of a gram in any vaporizer you're looking at, right? So that's what goes down into the bottom and into this thing, and then you inhale from here. So the good news about that is that if you're using a 20 or 25% THC strain in a vaporizer, and I told you right off the bat that 50% bioavailability, so let's say you're using a 20% THC, right, strain, break that down to 100 milligrams, and I told you off the bat that 20 milligrams is an average therapeutic dose. How many doses does 100 break down into? 20, 40, 60, 81, right? And if it's 25%, it breaks down into 4 simple doses. And you could do that QID, right? So if it only fits 0.25, you don't need a scale. You don't need the grind. The grinder's okay because it's good to get it nice and small to stuff in there. But you don't need to start, having a whole complicated, here, get the scale out, make sure you weigh 0.25 of a gram, make sure you weigh 0.33 of a gram. No. Fill the darn thing up. It's all that's going to fit in there. So it makes a lot more sense to use something like a 20% THC, even though they're not going to get 200 milligrams at one time. They're going to get 100 milligrams throughout the whole day should they want to use 1 gram a day. Makes a lot of sense because now they can do 4 or 5 therapeutic uses, dosing times throughout the day without having to use a scale because you just split it up into 4 equal parts or 5 equal parts. So it makes life a lot easier, right, if you're using that kind of strain. All right, so vaporization only, ingestion only, and the 2 together. General principles of the actual dosing guideline. Start low and go slow. Well, I think that's self-explanatory. I say vaporize before ingestion. There's people who argue going the other method, using ingestion only, and that's fine. I'll tell you, in the adult or in the elderly population, try teaching them to vaporize. I mean, some really love it. I gave a good fun talk for Probus, which is like the largest retirement group in Canada, maybe North America, I don't know. And these guys, and they're active people between ages of 65 and 90. And maybe 75. I can't remember exactly. But these guys were like, yeah, we want to vaporize, we want to ride our bikes and go to the park. We're not driving anyways. So some of them really enjoy it. And it was great to see them. And they were planting. They're like, can we grow it? They want to plant this stuff. And I'll tell you, that's actually really therapeutic for a lot of people. Remember, we're talking about functional outcomes here, right? Am I going to treat their disease? Probably not. They're going to have arthritis the rest of their lives. They're going to have cancer, probably not going to cure your cancer. But if I can help you live a better life, and that's why I like the whole plant, because the whole plant is therapeutic. Because now you get to plant the plant, you get to watch it grow, you get to go to the park, you get to ride your bicycle. You know, you get active, you go outside. Hopefully you don't fall off, wear a helmet. Reminds me, Dr. Bailey once told me if you ever have something. Anyway, forget it, I'm going to skip that. That's probably totally inappropriate. I was at trauma rounds when he said it, but I'll skip it. You won't find a funny pharmacist. I don't know, doctors, pharmacists, I don't know. Oh, what I would tell you, by the way, Pram, who was like literally, can you imagine if we were at rounds as physicians and some guy was asking us questions? That's amazing. I love that you did that as a summary. That's great. I don't think I've ever sat at a CME and was asked questions the next day. Nobody would raise their hands and give an answer. You guys are super interactive over that. That's great. You paid attention. No, the doctor would be like, walking away. I wasn't really paying attention. I'm here for food. Anyway, so I thought it was great. But am I wrong? Like, you asked questions. Have you ever seen that? It was great. Okay. Anyway, I'll move on. So other things. Vaporize before ingestion. Oh, no, that's not they do look similar. Huh? I picked that up. You see, they are quite discreet. I was going to try to get the thing to switch. It won't work. Okay. Oh, no, let's go back. Okay, so vaporize before ingestion. I always like to have a little CBD, even with a high THC strain. And the reason, as we spoke about before, is because it can offset some of the negative side effects. At the same time, it may decrease some of the therapeutic benefits, but if you're using it in a ratio that's like a 1-to-3 or a 3-to-1, it won't affect it all that much, at least from clinical, empirical trial and evidence. I don't have that in studies and randomized controlled trials, but at least in the empirical evidence, that's what we see. One of the obvious things that we do, it's actually not that obvious. As physicians, we don't always spend the time we need. We don't have the opportunity. It's not for the lack of trying. We don't have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with patients. But one of the things that we should start doing, and we do with cannabis, and this takes into account, is that they keep a diary. The patient is actively involved in their medicine. This is a paradigm shift, right? There's no, here's, take your medicine, go home, come see us. This is, be involved in your medicine. You need to be involved in your care. You have responsibility here too. And people want that responsibility. So keep a diary. Have them keep a diary so that when they come back or when we call them on the phone or, and we want to find out how they're doing and we have all the follow-ups, and you'll hear about all this stuff later, you'll know that, we'll be able to see, has it been working for you? What was your initial dose? How many inhalations did you use? Did you have to start, did you have to move on too quick or too slowly? Should we have started with something different? You'll see all that when you keep a diary. And then a couple things that I want to talk about with vaporization. One of the most important things is to have a digital thermometer. So if you look at this one here, this has a digital thermometer. I'm not sure if the PAX has it. There's the new PAX that has one, but that may just have the buttons. I don't know. A digital thermometer, so it's the new one, which is great. So one of the old PAXs and a whole bunch of the old vaporizers, I'm glad people are starting to listen. They used to have these buttons that you just press 1, 2, 3, or 4. And it would say, this is equivalent, perhaps, to an temperature X. What you really want is something that has a digital thermometer because, we're talking about vaporization, but what does vaporization actually do? Every plant has a level in which they give, not just cannabis, anything, at a level at which they heat up, don't combust, and become active. So THC and CBD have different levels at which they heat up, the trichome becomes active, and the actual cannabinoid loses its acidic form, takes the A off, and then becomes active. So without combustion. And you want to make sure you're far below the level of combustion. And if you have a thermometer that doesn't, or if you have a vaporizer that just has button 1, 2, 3, or 4, and everybody's pressing 4, these guys are usually combusting. Because most vaporizers, you can still combust through. If you go over, if you go over 210 degrees Celsius, or 230 degrees Celsius, maybe upwards of 375 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 400, anyways, depends, somewhere between those two, you're in levels of combustion. So you want to stay below that level. So all vaporizers can still combust, and we don't want that to happen. So we know that THC vaporizes at 156 degrees Celsius, and we know that CBD vaporizes at somewhere between 189 to 186 to 189 degrees Celsius. Those are the levels of vaporization. So most people, I tell them to start, put no higher than 190 degrees Celsius. You're safe, you're below the level of combustion, and you're able to vaporize the cannabinoids that we need to vaporize. Does it make sense why we need a digital thermometer? Good. All right. Do we need a, oops, man, I keep messing that up. Do we need a grinder? I mean, we should. It's nice if you had a nice little grinder so that you can take your plant material or the flower material, call it whatever you want to call it, bud, I call it flower. You can take the dried flower and you can grind it into small little pieces so that it's able to stuff into that little area that you want to put your cannabis in, which is at the bottom of this thing. And then you need the dry flower. Currently on the market, the legal market, we don't have vaporizable oil. LPs currently have, some LPs have a third method, which is a spray, which isn't bad, and you can get milligram dosing from it, and it's water soluble, which is kind of neat. But for the most part, we have two methods. You're either using dry flower or oil. Dry flower we can vaporize, oil we can ingest. Eventually, and I would say within the next year, LPs are going to start having vaporizable oil. I think we're going to be moving away in the medical world from flower altogether. Currently, we still have it on the market, but we're going to be moving away from it. So currently, this is what you need. Digital thermometer, dry flower, and a grinder. You guys went through this yesterday. You went through this yesterday. I'm not going to go through the whole mechanism, but with each vaporizer has a heating mechanism, a temperature mechanism, extraction mechanism, and then chamber for the medicine. Okay, so chart 1. Here we go. This is what we're here for. So now that we know the entire background, how do we actually start? Okay, so dry cannabis only, chart number 1. Do you guys have this in front of you? Okay, great. So you're going to see on the left side we've the day, and then along the top we have AM, noon, evening, or night. When I say the word night, oh, I pointed that, should have been up here. When I say the word night, it doesn't have to be nighttime. I mean when there's nothing to do. If somebody is not having an active day, they can put this first day in the morning. Doesn't matter. I usually start it at night because people are home at night and they have nowhere to go for a couple hours. Unless you were like me and you worked only night shifts in the emergency department, but I just left, so it doesn't matter. So my nights are now free-ish. Okay, so day 1, this is for dry cannabis only, no matter how much CBD is in here. We're going to base this dosing off of THC because that's the one that really sort of plays an effect. Of course, what you want to do if they're using CBD, of course you would use the same starting point, but you're not so worried because you're not going to get that psychoactive effect. You can use this for THC or CBD, but at the same time, usually I start whenever we're talking about a dosing protocol. We're talking about how to dose THC because it's the one with the psychoactive effects or any of the other negative side effects that usually get from cannabis. So this is the one you want to start lower or slower than you want to start CBD. But it's always okay to start CBD this way as well. If they're only using a strain like Charlotte's Web and they're vaping it, it's totally fine to start with 0.25, but I don't care if they start with 0.5. It won't make much of a difference to them. So day 1. Initiation of any strain. I also want to preface one other thing. This is a template. This is a template to start from. You don't have to start with this. This is an interactive template. This is just one good way to start that makes it easy for patients. But if you say, well, 0.25, I am 0.2 worked in there, 0.3, whatever, however it is, they can fill up the darn chamber. Okay? So the chamber's filled with 0.25 of a gram, because that's all that fits in the chamber anyways. Take one deep inhalation and wait 5 minutes for acute effects to onset. That's usually what it is. If it doesn't work after 5 minutes, take a second inhalation, okay? And then wait. That's it for night one. This is also, it's called the Price Protocol for the initiation of the naive patient, right? So when I say naive, I don't mean, you know what I mean, receptor naive, the receptor naive patient. So 2 inhalations day one, that's all they're going to do. That's it. Their receptors are going to upregulate. You're going to start learning. Their body's going to start learning what cannabis is. It may do nothing for them night one. I'm fine with that. I'd rather it do nothing than a lot of something. So we're doing nothing night one. So you take 2 inhalations, wait 5 minutes in between each one, call it a day. That's learning the effects. Day 2, finding the therapeutic dose for the strain. So you could put 0.25 to 0.33. Again, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Whatever it fills up to, if you're using a 20% THC, it would make sense because then you're getting one therapeutic, one filling up of that vaporizer with the 0.22 to 0.2 or 0.3, whatever it fills up to, is one therapeutic episode of using cannabis. The question is, how many inhalations is it going to take for that therapeutic use to get in? So if you're using a vaporizer, you're looking at about 6 to 8 inhalations. And then, how do you know it's finished? You'll open it up, you'll look, and it's turned from green to brown. So anything after 8 inhalations of 0.25 or we'll call it 1 bowl, whatever they fill it up to in there, after that, it's not going to be useful anymore. You'll notice it doesn't smell the same anymore. The terpenoids are all gone. And that therapeutic dose, that therapeutic episode is done. Okay? So on day 2, you can go up to 6 times. Usually by 6 times, it's all done. May inhale up to 6 times, waiting 5 minutes between each inhalation. And then, of course, pack it up, whatever, moving on. Increasing your daily dose. So day 3. So this is it could be at any time of the day they have nothing to do. Usually it works at nighttime. If they're trying to sleep or help with their pain at night, it's always good I start at night. Now, we want to start increasing their their vaporization dose or usage. So day 3, that's where they can start using it in the morning and then again at night. Anywhere between day 4 and 7, that's where they can start increasing it morning, noon, evening, night. They don't have to use it at all. It could be a PRN dose. They don't have to use it. But if they're going to start using it 3 or 4 times a day, and you were using, let's say, a 20% THC, or, you'd have to get really high to get a lot of CBD to get the actual amount of CBD you need. It's always good to ingest CBD because you can get more of it a lot, than you can when you vaporize it. But at the same time, it'll still take effect even if you don't get the therapeutic dose. What we find, at least from the studies, what we do find is that you still will end up with some therapeutic benefit from it, from CBD, even if it's not the proper dose. So any amount is still good. But here, you can use it whenever you sort of need it. If they don't need it, then just don't use it. So day 1, day 2, they don't have to be at night, sort of mentioned. And you can stop at any, you don't have to inhale 6 times. If you got this is the start low, go slow. This is where okay, we're recording, I'll stand here. This is where I had that whole conversation in my head. I was going to come down. I'm like, no, because there's a camera. Anyways, I'm standing here. So you don't have to use all 6 of them. Let's say after 2 doses or 2 inhalations, they found therapy. They found that therapeutic dose was 2. So that's their therapeutic dose. Chart it down in their diary. That's their therapeutic. It doesn't have to be 6. 6 inhalations is when that actual amount that they've loaded the cannabis into the vaporizer with, that's when it will be used up. That's when it becomes done. Make sense? But you're starting low, going slow. You're going anywhere from 1 inhalation or 2 inhalations up to 6 inhalations. But let's say at 3 or 4, they're like, that's all I needed. Okay, so stop them there, jot it down. That for you is your therapeutic dose. Now you can start using it morning, noon, and night. Make sense? Beautiful. See, finally, we're getting some interaction here. I feel I'm going to start asking questions. Pram had it right. So, what is 10% THC convert into? If you're what's it depend on? Method. Somebody said method. Method of use. So, combustion. 10%. 10 to 15, who knows? Vaporization. Beautiful. And oral, ingestion, 20 to 30%. Okay, so we pay attention. That's good. I'm going to start asking questions at other CMEs, see if people react, throw me off stage, start throwing things at me. Okay, so dosing, ingestion only. So this is more for the, if you're starting with it, it's more for the experienced user who's used cannabis before, or for the person who just prefers to ingest only because they have an aversion to inhalation. And you see that a lot, right? Again, this is our confirmation bias because inhaling anything isn't all, like we don't like that. But so for that person, you may want to do that, start them with ingestion only. So different in absorption between ingestion versus oral mucosa. We kind of spoke about that already, right? And types of ingestion. You can either, you have cannabis oil, then you have teas. People like to make teas. People like to, if you want to, especially my elderly population, they love drinking tea. So you can actually go online, or you can go to the website or wherever, and you have videos eventually up there showing you how to make a tea using cannabis. And one of the easiest ways is you take actually dried cannabis, and you put it in, you steep it in a fat, because of course we know that it's not water soluble, so you want it to combine with the fat, and then you can pour it into your tea and do whatever you want. Make regular tea with it. Steep it for 20 minutes. What you don't want to do is boil it, because you don't want to flash vapor. You don't want to flash burn all of the cannabinoids off of it. But it's okay to do that, and then it can cool down. It's already absorbed into the tea, and then you can ingest it and do whatever you want. So teas are another way of doing it. And then, of course, you have cannabis butter, cannabis oils, and a whole bunch of other things. But for our sake, the simplest thing we're going to do, and what we're going to do for our chart, is we're going to use cannabis oil that we get from a licensed producer. Again, we're going to start low. We're going to go slow. We spoke about that, and I'm going to keep hitting you with that point. Not all ingestions are made equal. I told you. Cannabis oil that we get from an LP versus extractions produced from dry flower. Did you decarb it versus not decarboxylate it? If you haven't decarboxylated, you're going to lose a lot more of it through first-pass metabolism. And so what you'll hear on the street is people saying, I've activated my cannabis. It's activated. Press the button, beam me up, Scotty. What they're really saying is they've decarbed their cannabis, right? Or decarboxylated their cannabis. Most of the oils that come from LPs now are decarboxylated, but there's still a bunch of LPs that haven't done it, in which case you're not really going to get the whole therapeutic benefit that they tell you possibly will. Oh, no, see, go figure. Now I'm pressing the back button. Again, we already spoke about this, so I'm going to skip over that slide. All right, so this is actually the table. It should say table 2. This should say table 1. And that can say chart 2, because this table goes along with the next chart. So, again, I'm dosing it based on THC for the simple fact that it's the one that contains most of the negative side effects. You can still use the same thing when having CBD. Usually people that have a THC around here, around here, less than 5 milligrams, it's usually like a 1 THC to 20 to 25 CBD. This is where I'll start them for their CBD, with their CBD oil. Whereas over here, if it's more than 10 milligrams per milliliter, this is where I start them with the people that use a high THC. Okay, so we have day again, and then we have, does the strain contain less than 5 milligrams of THC? Less than 10 milligrams of THC, or greater than 10 milligrams of THC. It simplifies it into 3 simple methods. Clearly, if this one's less than 5 milligrams, it's going to have a high CBD. That's what you're looking. The people that don't want any THC, they usually want a high CBD. You can start them on this method, or over here. People that want more of a balance, or are using a balanced THC because maybe there's something that they need the THC for, but they also want the CBD. that's over here, and then clearly the people that are using higher THC are over here. So, day 1, day 2. Start them at you can start them at 0.5 ml with this. Usually it's for somebody who has a high THC or a high CBD count, high CBD strain, starting at half an ml. You may think that's high, but it's not, because this one is really the one that's super high. So, no, that's per dose. Per dose. And again, you can divide, and when we go to the next thing, we'll tell you how to do it. So this is your high CBD strain. The high CBD stuff, you can start them at 0.5, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Just read the thing. It's pretty straightforward. If it's less than 10 milligrams, that's still pretty a high amount of THC. Considering you look at something like Nabilone, it only has 1 milligram in it. Even though it's synthetic, it's still 1 milligram, and it's so variable. And remember, we're talking about a 1 milliliter dosing regimen, right? Because that's the little Dopplers that come with it. So the same way that you look at Tempra, the Tylenol stuff, it comes with the same kind of dropper. So for somebody that has less than 10 milligrams, you're going to start them around 0.25 milliliters, their first go. And then that's for day 1, day 2, and you're just going to plop in either column 1, column 2, or column 3 into this next slide. So here's the chart for oil only. Again, in the evening, it doesn't have to be the evening, but it's always good to start with an evening. Start when they have nothing to do. Morning, noon, again, evening is needed. So this is where you refer to the chart. So this is where you're going to plop in this, either column 1, 2, or 3. Make sense? Into here. So let's say they're using a high CBD. If they were using a high CBD with THC that was less than 5 milligrams per milliliter, which table would you plop into that area? Table 1, 2, or which column? Column 1, 2, or 3? 1, right. Now let's go back here. If, in the same vein, if they were using, let's say, something that had like, it was 10 milligrams of THC and 10 milligrams of CBD per 1 milliliter, and again, you were just initiating them, it was their first day, which column from this table would you plop in there? 2. You could start them at 2 or 3, depending on how you thought, how old they were, or based on their habitus, based on their reservations to the use of cannabis. Of course, it's never wrong to start them at any of these 3. Okay, so you're going to do that for day 1, day 2. And remember, the time to onset is different. Time to onset with ingestion is shorter or longer than vaporizing? Longer, somewhere around 60 to 90 minutes. How long does it last for? Yeah, I would say 4 to 6 hours. You're looking at 4 to 5 hours for the acute effects. Remember, it stores in fat. So all cannabinoids store in fat. So based on body habitus, it will also decide how long those effects last. But you're looking at somewhere between 4 to 6 hours. Good. So day 3, day 4, again, you're titrating their oil. How do you titrate the oil? Well, you follow the columns. It's pretty straightforward. Day 5, day 7, again, you're still titrating or maintaining the oil. Now, day 8, you can either add a new strain or start using that strain in the morning. Okay, so now our goal is to get them up to 3 times a day, should they want to. Again, the same idea with vaporization. They don't have to use it at any time. It's just to maintain. The reason why it's like this, I always look at this, my goal is to get them off of the other drugs that are killing them, right? Or is to get them off of, let's say, their opioids. They want off of some opioid, or they want off of gabapentin, or they want off of a benzo of some sort, right? So the nighttime, this will probably be a higher THC for them because it's going to help them sleep. But during the day, they're probably going to want a higher CBD because it'll help with inflammation. It'll help a little bit with the neuropathic pain if they have, like, say, trigeminal neuralgia, or if they have some other neuropathic disorder. Anyways, so you may use a daytime strain here, right? So this will, again, so now let's say you're starting in the morning, and let's say they want let's say they're using it has 1 milligram of THC and 25 milligrams of CBD. Which column would you start with? Pardon? Which column would we start with? We would start with, right, we'd start with 1 because this is column for somebody who's using less than 5 milligrams THC. High CBD doesn't matter. We want the high CBD. This is basically your high CBD strain, high CBD lane as well. Starting point. Good. And then you're going to titrate again, day 9, day 10, evening, day 11, day 12, you have the morning, and then you see your evening oil, and day 13, a daytime oil, which is the higher CBD stuff, higher THC stuff, help them sleep. And then, of course, greater than 2 weeks, they can start using it morning, noon, and night. Question is, how do you start getting them off their opioids? How do you start interacting with those things? Just because they're on opioids doesn't mean they can't use cannabis. Just means you have to start. One, it's not your job to decrease them, right? That has to go back to the prescriber of their opioid. And we follow the national pain guideline. That's what I follow when I take people off of opioids. That's what we should all be following in Canada. And that's 10% decrease per week until they're down to about 20%. That's the standard for decreasing an opioid in Canada following the national pain guideline. So that's usually what I do. I usually take them off their quick-acting stuff first, off their pain candies, and that's usually either their Hydromorph quick release or their Percocets. And I change that, like I said, with vaporization, and then I still let them, they're still using their long-acting, and then I start introducing an evening oil, and then I start having them decrease their long sustained release opioid at that time as well, 10% per week. And eventually we get them off both, and they're vaping and they're using oils. How do we do that? Well, this is how. Dry cannabis plus ingestion. So let's say they're doing both. Initially, they vape twice a day, and then they use their oil based on the chart at night. They're vaping, chart again. Day 5, day 6, we're doing it as needed, right? Stable oil dose at night, we're finding out. Stable, eventually by day 8, day 10, they're now gonna be, instead of vaping in the morning, they're gonna use their stable daytime oil in the morning, vape as needed through the day, and then use their oil again at night. Eventually by week 2, at the end of week 2, they're gonna be using an oil in the morning, maybe an oil in the afternoon, and then maybe an oil at night, and vaping as they need throughout the day. So you have somebody that's using an oil in the morning, now an oil at noon, they have the sustained stuff. Remember, they don't have to do anything. They can use it, all I need it, doc, is once in the morning or once at nighttime. I don't need it throughout the day. And that's why when we use the chart, it's a progression. It's not like, here, start at day 1 and use it 3 times a day. No, it's start at nighttime. If you need it, use it in the morning. If you need it, use it in the afternoon. If you need it, use it in the evening. For which part? Yeah, so what you're seeing for the THC part is people starting at 0.2 or 0.25, the oils that they're using, and 100%. That's why we have it here as their starting point. Of course, there's always differences, right? Again, it's based on metabolism, based on comorbidities, but you're always safe starting at 0.2. 0.2, and that's why I have it here. Usually it's some there, and those people are usually using, if they are, even in the elderly, they're using a THC that's probably more than 5 and less than 10, because unless they're using a CBD. And if they're using a CBD, you're fine starting an elderly patient on CBD at around 0.5. You may start a little bit lower if they need to, but based on, I don't know, I've maybe treated 10,000 patients, and that's basically what it looks like. Yes. No. Well, so it's a good question. It becomes it becomes complicated, but you'd use a stepwise approach. You start them on a lower dose. As they start decreasing their opioid, then you would start increasing it. I would start them on a low THC, something, if they're using an oil, I would start them something that was less than 5 milligrams. As they're starting to decrease their opioid, then I would start increasing. And what I can tell you is we don't have any RCTs on that kind. I'm currently working on those, but we don't have any published data on it.
The comparison of the ingestion protocol versus the vape protocol, perhaps I'm missing something in the math. I don't think I am. No, they're very different.
Yes.
The amount that you're getting, your vapor flavor,
You're getting a lot more vapor milligram than you are from ingesting. Yeah, it's huge, yeah. And that's because of metabolism. It's so variable. It's so variable. There are some people that do need, like, For example, when I say greater than 10, this is just a start. They can always go to more than 1. I have patients, for example, who are even elderly patients who are over here. They're using like an 18 milligram per milliliter or a 25 milligram per milliliter, but they get and had never used cannabis before and now are up to like 1.5 milliliters at each therapeutic dose. So it's so variable. If you look at that Grotenherman paper from 2003 looking at the PKPD, you'll notice the variability when it comes to ingesting cannabis is all over. That's why it's good to start them low, and eventually they may need to get up there.
So then if the vape protocol seems aggressive, maybe this is like either one's conservative or one's aggressive. It's very different.
No, they're not. So look at, if we go back to this, dry cannabis only. Remember, 0.25, 1 inhalation, right? Our goal is to get 20 milligrams at one given time. Eventually, that's 1 therapeutic dose for inhalation, at least according to most of the studies that are out there. But that being said, I'm not starting them at 6. It's just you can increase quicker because it's easily titratable. Quick onset, quick offset, very linear PKPD. So we're really only starting with 1 inhalation, right? So it's not really that aggressive. It actually just starts very slow. You can just increase quicker because they can self-titrate a lot easier. All right. And then, of course, to finish, they can use their oils as they need it, and then they vape in between as they need it. So now you have somebody who's using vaporization and using oils. Now here's, I'll tell you, the one thing that we're starting to see, and we need to be really mindful of it, I mentioned it yesterday, is it's oil-based. Oils are not good for us. And I think with time, we're going to start changing that with nanotechnology and with water solubility. But, people come in and they tell us, I want to use coconut oil because it's going to cure the world. It's a fully saturated fat. And if you're using it 3 times a day, your liver's going to potentially sustain damage, not from the cannabis, but from the oil. So we need to be careful, and we need to remember that, especially in people that, for example, have have compromised livers to begin with. I have a lot of patients that stay off of alcohol, let's say, because with the use of it, or of fatty liver, or of Hep C, or of HIV, and they all have these things. So the question is, what do you give them? I'd rather give them an oil that's a polyunsaturated fat than a fully saturated fat, right? It's not heated up. They're not heating it. If they're not heating it, if they're heating it up, now this goes into the nutrition world. If you heat up a polyunsaturated fat, it releases free radicals. It may not be good for you. Whereas if you heat up a fully saturated fat, it doesn't release those as many free radicals. So it may be better to cook with something like coconut oil, but it's better to ingest a polyunsaturated fat. So also knowing which fat comes from different LPs is important, or which oil. But either way, you still want to limit their oil intake because of the oil itself. But there are other ways to do it. There are some LPs that have sprays. There are some LPs that, or even better yet, there's drink mixes. You can put the oil in that emulsify the fat altogether. They're not so natural yet because it's not natural to emulsify something. So if somebody is health conscious and concerned about what's going into their body, using an emulsification may be an issue. But for the most part, you can still do it. There's a good mix out there called Dynamix that does that. And I don't know if I just plugged them. It wasn't my point to. I have no vested interest whatsoever in them. But I know it does work because I use it for patients all the time. Anyway, so that's what we have. And in summary, hold on. It's important to understand bioavailability of the different methods of use. Understand your patient's dose based on the different forms of administration, and dosing charts are templates only. Remember, dosing needs to be individualized, and we need to be mindful about that. It's not just take your pill, go home. It's something a little bit more complicated. But just following these charts can make it pretty simple to get them started. All right, I got done. Yes.
You didn't touch on it at all, Larry, but can you comment on the merits of topicals?
Sure. Variable. So remember, cannabis is fat soluble, not water soluble. I hear all the time people using, cannabis oil because it's going to help my muscles. Well, you got to get below the basement membrane in order to get to your muscle. So if you want it to work, and I actually do it all the time. I have them take their oil, put it into a cream that's already made with a protein carrier that carries the rest of it, mix it together, then it can be useful, potentially useful. Like a DMSO, for example, or like I mentioned yesterday, or a linalool, which is a terpene that's actually found within cannabis. And those are both known to be protein carriers that help make things more water soluble. So, if you attach those things to the cannabis, it can be helpful. Do I have studies on these things? I don't. Have I seen anecdotally amazing outcomes with some of these things? Certainly. But is it my first line go-to it all? Of course, that's where it becomes the art. Eventually, I think we'll get to studies that show, there's studies going on with transdermal stuff now. I use creams, for example, on rashes. And I've seen diabetic ulcers disappear. But I'm not going to prescribe those things. If somebody's like, hey, I just used it, I'm like, okay, great. I'm glad it worked. But that's not my first line go-to. All right, guys. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Okay, guys, we're just going to take a 10-minute quick break, and then we'll reconvene back here. Thanks.